Hi, my name is Alana. I'm a student here at Johns Hopkins University, and because of the amazing collections we have at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, I've gotten to study, interact with, and learn from amazing objects from all over the globe. One huge lesson that I've learned is that objects are so much more than the beginning when they were created and the end where I'm encountering them. There are thousands and thousands of years between those 2 points that make up an incredibly interesting part of the object's life.
This is referred to as the object biography, described here by scholar Jody Joy as following an object's life from birth through life to death.
Today we'll be following the journey of one object through its entire life. The phases of this object's life that we'll be examining are its creation, initial use, burial, rediscovery in modern times, collection, arrival at the museum, and museum research and exhibition. Let's jump right in with creation. Let's start at the very beginning with the creation of this object. When you look at it, you can tell it's clearly pretty ancient, but that doesn't answer the question of when it was made and where in the world did this object come from. This boat is Egyptian. Now, that doesn't narrow it down so much, does it? Ancient Egypt was an incredibly long period of time, thousands of years. Based on the type of object and the features of the boat, we can narrow it down to the Middle Kingdom, specifically the earlier end of the Middle Kingdom. Egyptologists do stylistic comparisons between this boat and the boats from other tombs where we know the year that they were created to determine the period in which this boat was made. Now that we've narrowed down time, can we narrow down place? Because of the way this object was obtained, narrowing down exactly where this object is from is a little tricky. For more information, let's turn to an expert opinion from my friend Meg.
Cohen tells us that he found this boat in Thebes, so whether or not it was made in sort of a Theban workshop seems likely, difficult to prove with so little information about it.
So, Egyptologists must piece together information about this boat through stylistic comparisons and other forms of investigation. When you think of a work of art, you often think of the artist who created it. Is it Degas? Is it Michelangelo? Is it Picasso? Is it Dali? In the case of ancient art, though, it's often really hard to determine who the artist was.
Especially in like cultic centers or urban centers, there would have been these regional workshops. We also have evidence that artists were traveling around at this time. So they were going to different centers. And you do see some regional styles with some of the boats and the other wooden models. But because we do have the mobility of artists and whatnot, it's hard to think that these regional workshops would have been entirely divorced from sort of the centralized government and sort of this centralized style that sort of marks the art of a given era.
During this period, there were often specialized workmen who each worked on a different stage of the creation process for a boat like this one. Now that we've got the who, what, where, and when of the object, let's think about why. Whenever an object is created, it's made for some sort of purpose. By comparing this wooden boat to others created at the same time period, we know that this boat was not used in daily life, but it was created for funerary purposes only. Immediately after creation, this object would have been placed in somebody's tomb.
We can learn a lot about the purpose of this object by determining what type of boat this model is meant to represent. Let's turn again to Meg to hear her insight.
So this particular boat, based on its style, a number of stylistic markers, and its form, suggests that it is one of these funerary boats. And while it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between funerary boats that were used to transport the mummy to its tomb across the Nile, or these boats that were used for these pilgrimages, so the emplacements, the holes that are on the top of this boat, suggests that it has two rudder posts in the back, and then there's no indication that there's any type of mast. or any slots for figures that would have been rowers. So this means that it was most likely towed. It has no means of propelling itself. So these type of boats that were just towed were typically used for transporting the mummy across the Nile to the tomb. So suggests that this boat was likely a funerary type. And this is also suggested by the color. So the hull is green. This is meant to represent the papyrus from which the boats were made. And then it has a wedge-out eye on the side, which is also characteristic of these funerary boats.
There are a few features of this boat that are different than the features of mummy transportation boats. It's hard to tell exactly what kind of boat this is because there are no figures on top. Having a mummy transportation boat model in your tomb would help the tomb owner to constantly be reborn into the afterlife.
It's interesting that at this time in the Middle Kingdom and sort of at the end of the first intermediate period, the period right before this, it's the first time that you really start getting grave goods made specifically for the tomb on a large scale. And you also get an emphasis on sustaining the dead in the afterlife. So I mentioned the afterlife is very much like the earthly life. You sort of have all your same earthly needs. For the funerary boat, I guess you're maintaining the Egyptians sort of believed in a cyclical rebirth. So the funeral, you can imagine being carried out over and over again, ensuring that the dead is going to be reborn into the afterlife. So important that they're maintaining this aspect in their funerary assemblage.
For thousands of years, this boat remained in the tomb, allowing the tomb owner to maintain the funeral rite in his afterlife. How did an object like this survive thousands of years inside a tomb and still look as great as it does today? Most conservators and scientists agree that a relatively stable environment in terms of relative humidity and temperature allows an object to reach a sort of equilibrium and maintain their state for thousands of years. Let's turn to our conservation expert to hear a little bit more about how this object survived.
Given that it's a boat made out of wood and paint and plaster and has all of these components that are part of it, I'm always astonished by how these materials survive the archaeological record. I mean, Egypt is extraordinary in that all sorts of things that wouldn't survive in almost any other place do tend to survive in Egypt, just given the sort of climate and the way things are preserved in often sort of sandy conditions as opposed to soil. And so I'm usually finding that my breath is taken away by the fact that these things exist at all.
Obviously, the boat is not in the tomb anymore, so how is it rediscovered in modern times? This is where many of the difficulties in knowing about this object arise. Today, we do systematic archaeological excavations where the exact context of where everything that is excavated is recorded. However, when this boat was rediscovered, that was not the case. Due to laws at the time, locals had access to essentially whatever they wanted legally, so they would take objects from the tombs and bring them to eager customers. Now, I keep mentioning this mysterious collector who purchased this boat in Egypt. Who are we talking about? His name is Mendes Cohen. He was born in 1796 and moved to Baltimore after his father passed away. He made lots of money through his banking and lottery businesses and retired at the young age of 33. During his retirement, he decided to travel all through Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. What kind of guy was Cohen anyway? Let's turn to Kate, who's done a lot of research on Cohen, to learn more about his collection.
Somebody referred to him as the Forrest Gump of Maryland history. He seemed to have been a very personable person, and he was at the coronation of the Queen. He was in the company of the Pope. Like, he just happened to be, in the Battle of 1812. And he just seemed to show up in these sort of historically significant moments.
Now let's zoom in on Cohen's time in Egypt. Cohen traveled through Egypt for about 4.5 months in the 1830s. He hired his own boat and started at Damietta. Then he traveled all the way down the Nile to the Second Cataract in Nubia. Then he went back up to Cairo and spent some time there before leaving and continuing on his travels. Throughout this entire journey, Cohen was collecting. Now, what kinds of things was Cohen buying on his journeys? Obviously, he was buying ancient objects, but at the time they were seen as antiquities, not necessarily as art. He was buying multiples of the same kind of item, and he was also buying smaller, more portable items. Cohen was also collecting anthropological objects, including plant and wildlife samples, as well as ethnographic objects. And of course, he purchased our friend the boat in Thebes. We don't know a ton of the exact specifics about how Cohen was purchasing all of his objects.
He doesn't surprisingly refer to his collecting very much in his journal. So we know that he does have one reference in his journal about him staying on his boat, and the local people are bringing him objects, and he stays there for 2 days, and he essentially can buy what he wants.
Now, another question that you might be thinking about, why is this guy buying all this stuff? Well, that's another question we don't exactly know the answer to. Either way, it seems like his intent was to create a collection. Between the time of collection by Cohen and the time of the arrival at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum is also a bit of a mystery. Mendes Cohen passed away in 1879, unmarried, with no children. After he passed away, his collection was given to his nephews, who then donated it to Johns Hopkins in 1884. The Cohen collection has been a part of Johns Hopkins almost since its founding. Having teaching collections was one of the founding visions for Johns Hopkins as a research university. As I mentioned, a majority of Cohen's collection arrived at Johns Hopkins in 1884. So what's it been doing the entire time it's been at Hopkins? Cohen's collection, from its arrival at Johns Hopkins to now, has always been accessible to students. Based on this picture, we know that in 1915, part of the Cohen collection was located in McCoy Hall at Hopkins' old downtown campus. These days, the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum uses modern museum standards, so collections are a little less accessible than they used to be, but they are always still accessible to students. A lot of research has been done to piece together the story of Cohen's collection, including this boat. The goal of this research is to document all of the different changes that have happened to the boat, as well as all of the different interactions that people have had with the boat over the course of its life. There's a lot of documentation that can be used to piece together this story. Comparing Cohen's 3 different ledgers has been one of the main avenues of research for this collection. I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk about the little minutiae that become incredibly important when doing this kind of documentary research.
I've gotten to the point where I look at handwriting on the objects, the stickers that are on the objects. Each collector used different kinds of stickers.
Scientific techniques are also used to learn about the past life of this boat. Scientific techniques can inform how we understand the original manufacturing techniques and material aspects of an object. This contributes to not just our understanding of how the object was made, but the people who created the object and who used the object. Conservation research is still being done on the boat.
What I'm really interested in now is looking much more closely at the sequence of the painting and the ways in which these different materials are used in different elements on the boat. And then we're of course missing a lot of the sort of accoutrements that went on top of the boat. We have 4 figures, but we're missing all of the other parts that they were holding and were sort of around them. So I'm very interested in thinking about, well, first, whether we can find any of them, and then really trying to maybe digitally reconstruct what this boat might have looked like when it was in much more complete condition.
But what is physically happening to the boat right now in the museum? Well, a number of preventative care techniques are applied to the boat in order to keep it in the amazing condition that it's still in, allowing people to use collections for such functions as teaching and research allows an object to be cared for and to be checked in on every once in a while. Of course, you want to know about the new exhibit that this boat will be a part of at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum.
But we never really knew the driving force behind his ordering in this lithograph. But when we found the earliest version of the catalog, we found at the top of the page that he's writing Western case, shelf 1. So it turns out that this order mirrors the way that these objects were displayed in his house. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, for me, that sort of made Cohen and his collection come alive.
Kate and Meg were able to envision the collection in Cohen's home as he might have displayed it. Back when Cohen was collecting, the style was to organize your collection like a cabinet of curiosity.
By creating a very crowded sort of cabinet of curiosity, which is very much of Cohen's time, it will be a big contrast visually. And so that's why I think the exhibit, and the way that our cases are, we could mimic sort of maybe a feeling of a case that was in his house.
I'd like to turn it over to Professor Balachandran to mention again the real importance of object biographies.
Each time the object sort of moves from one place to another or one set of hands to another, there are often different interventions that happen at each stage. And so the boat that we see now in our museum space has not only this sort of ancient history of creation and use and placement, presumably in a tomb somewhere, but also an excavation history. It's been purchased, it's been moved around all over the world. We're not looking at a sort of pristine ancient surface. I don't think such a thing really even exists for things that have already been in collections.
Each interaction that a person had with this object left its mark on the boat. And that's what you're seeing when you look at an ancient object.